All right, so welcome back to Core 170. Happy St. Patrick's Day for those of you to which it's meaningful. Today what we're doing is continuing on with our discussion of instrumental variables. So let's start the way we try and start every time. Any questions, comments, concerns for the class before we get started? Going once, going twice. All right, so from last time, we introduced this new concept, this new identification strategy called instrumental variables. And again, this is one of those identification strategies that feels very mathy, but we're really not concerned with the math behind it. We're concerned with the concepts. It's our job as leaders to critique instrumental variables, to think deeply and to critique them. And the reason we use instrumental variables is from this concept called endogeneity. Endogeneity means determined within the system. And remember, though this is a weird word, though this is a strange, kind of dumb, kind of jargony word, it's something we're already familiar with through our data-driven work. It's something we're familiar with through our sample selection bias and our reverse causality bias, omitted variables. There's lots of different reasons that a variable can be endogenous. But when we have an endogenous variable, when we have something determined within the system, remember the discussion of the woman moving her rudder as she sails, it can be hard to determine a causal relationship. And as we always say in this class, these causal relationships are very important in data-driven work. It's our job as leaders to think about the causes and effects of things, and in particular, the effects of causes. So we introduced this concept called instrumental variables, and there were two things in particular that made an instrumental variable valid. One is the strength of the instrumental variable. It should cause the thing you're trying to instrument for. It should have some correlation with the endogenous variable. So last class we gave the example of how much fun Core 170 is endogenous to how much fun Sweetbriar as a whole is. We have some joint causality there. You all, as this robust, great class of students, makes Core 170 more fun. And I, of course, as a charming professor, through Core 170, make Sweetbriar more fun. So we have some joint causality, we have some reverse causality there, and we can't use one to estimate the other. So we talked about how can we instrument for how much fun Core 170 is as a way of thinking about the benefits Core 170 has for Sweetbriar. And the instrumental example we used was, relevant to our chit-chat before class, how much coffee I had that morning. How much coffee I have in a given morning can make Core 170 more or less fun, because I'll be more engaged, more active. But it's not really going to influence Sweetbriar in any way other than through this 8:30 class. By the time I get to my afternoon class, my morning coffee will have burned out. There's nothing it's going to do for my afternoon game theory class. The two things that make an instrumental variable valid are first the strength. We need it to correlate with the endogenous variable. How much coffee I have correlates with how much fun Core 170 is. But it can't be correlated with the effect, the outcome variable, in any way except through that endogenous relationship. We call that the exclusion restriction. So if how much coffee I have in the morning affected Sweetbriar in ways outside of Core 170, it would not be a very good instrument. Questions so far? So today what we're doing is just continuing on with our discussion of instrumental variables in this approach. And what we're doing in particular is going through a bunch of examples. We're doing application and critique of instrumental variables. So this is going to be one of those classes where I'm relying on you all to participate pretty heavily. But the good news is there's no wrong answers in today's class because it's critique, because it's opinion-based. So it's up to you to tell me whether or not you think something makes a good instrument. Why or why not? But you can have any number of reasons, and they can all be valid because it's opinion-based. Let's start with cardiac catheterization. And let's put some caveats on the table first. I'm going to get the medical science wrong. Let's just assume, for the sake of discussion, that I know what I'm talking about. But cardiac catheterization is a medical procedure used to diagnose and treat heart conditions. And in particular, we're going to talk about heart attacks. There's a long, flexible, thin tube called a catheter. It can be inserted in your arm. It can be inserted into your upper thigh. And it'll go through your veins and arteries all the way to your heart. Through this tube, the doctor can inject dye to run diagnostic tests. Maybe they can inject a balloon to do some sort of angio. This cardiac catheter is really good for heart patients. We think. We want to know whether or not cardiac catheterization is effective. So this is not a pre-med class, this is a decisions in a data-driven world class. How might we test, how might we use data to examine whether or not this procedure is effective? And again, I kind of punted on a lot of the medical science, so let's just pretend that we know a little bit more about cardiac catheterization than we might. Julia, was that a hand? All right.
Well, could you look at statistics or data involving accurate diagnosis without one and then diagnosis with getting the procedure completed?
That's a great example. So we should look at patient data, and we should look at patient outcomes. Whether or not you get the procedure, how long you live after getting the procedure. And then people who don't get the procedure, how long they live without getting the procedure. Sounds pretty good. Anyone else? Any other ways we can use data to examine catheterization? You can ignore the bird. Yeah, Renee. Yeah, so run studies, run tests. It sounds like what we're interested in is collecting a lot of data and looking at outcomes. We want to know whether or not this medical procedure is saying it sounds like the decision to treat a patient with a catheter is endogenous. And remember, with endogeneity, with endogenous variables, we can't determine proper causal outcomes. Why is the decision endogenous? Because the decision is made in the field and depends on unobserved patient health characteristics. And Elizabeth, to your point, we probably can't run an RCT yet. That might be a little unethical. So what if we have this problem where it's the healthy patients getting catheters? Or, Lily, to your point, what if we have this problem where it's the better doctors giving catheters? Then we're going to have some sort of simultaneous causality bias where, of course, patients with catheters are going to do better because it's healthier patients getting catheters anyway, or better doctors giving them, or some unobserved medical, correlated risk, or some comorbidity. So what can we do about this? What can we do about the fact that the decision to give a patient a catheter is endogenous? Well, the punchline is pretty much yesterday in today's lecture, we can take an instrumental variable approach. And remember, a good instrumental variable is one that's correlated with the endogenous variable. In this case, the endogenous variable is the decision to give a catheter, but not correlated with any of the outcomes. So it's fine if you guys can't yet because we're new to this approach, but can anyone think of an instrumental variable in this case? Can anyone think of something that meets those two criteria? Correlated with the decision, the endogenous variable, but uncorrelated with the outcome. Remember from Monday's discussion, good instrumental variables sound a little weird. They get a little creative. So the one that this medical journal used is distance to the nearest hospital, which gives catheters. Not every hospital has the resources or the medical technicians or whoever to provide patients with a catheter. So why might catheterization distance to a hospital that performs this procedure, be a good approach? Yeah, Juliet.
Wouldn't it localize results a little bit? So, like in the case of if you have to go to Virginia Tech for one place, you can just focus on the facility itself.
Okay, so to some extent, it might make results more local, so maybe we can ignore some of these correlated risks. Excellent point. Why else? Why might this be a good approach? And remember, we have two reasons why it can be good. The strength, why it's correlated with the outcome, or pardon me, why it's correlated with the endogenous variable, and the exclusion, why it's not correlated with anything else. So how might this be a strong instrument?
How far you are from the hospital might influence whether you get it or not.
Right. Patients that are close to catheterizing hospitals are probably more likely to get a catheter. Distance certainly is a strong instrument. Distance is going to influence whether or not you get it. It would be highly unlikely if you lived 10,000 miles from the nearest hospital that gives catheters for you to get a catheter. That's an extreme example, right? But we can think that distance is associated with whether or not you get it. Sounds like it might be a strong instrument. How might this be an exclusive instrument? How might distance to the nearest hospital that performs catheterization not be correlated with outcome? And again, we can get a little creative with these justifications. You can also answer this in reverse. Yeah.
I just think that maybe when you're undergoing treatment, like it doesn't matter at all what hospital you're at or the distance it took to get there.
Okay. So maybe distance is uncorrelated with patient outcomes conditional on treatment. Excellent point. Anyone else want to say this? And what I was going to say before Jackie's point was we can think about this in reverse. We can think about it how this might not be an exclusive instrument because those are just sort of two sides of the same coin. So yeah, what I said is if a catheterizing hospital is far away, the patient won't likely wind up there and likely won't get a catheter, right? Distance is probably a pretty strong instrument. And it meets the exclusion restriction if patients' locations function as if they're random. And we can think about some reasons why this might or might not be true. When we're picking where to live, we often think about things like, are there good jobs there? Are there good schools there? Do I like my friends and neighbors? Do I like the restaurants? Good coffee shops, good grocery stores? We might look into healthcare, certainly, but I don't know if we get as specific as, does this hospital perform cardiac catheterizing? If a patient's location is not random, right? We select our optimal location based on what's available to us. But if it's as if random, then we can treat it as an exclusive instrument. Why might this be a bad instrument? And the reasons why it might be a bad instrument is basically if you just flip strength and exclusion in reverse, right? If it's not a strong instrument, it's a bad instrument. And if it's not an exclusive instrument, it's a bad instrument. So knowing what we know about cardiac catheterization, which again isn't much, we sort of sped over the medical aspect of it, why might this be a bad instrument? So going back to Emily Oster, which hospitals have the most advanced techniques? Is it random? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Well, it was like the level 4 NICUs, which are usually found in like bigger cities.
Okay, so maybe bigger cities have more advanced hospitals. Do we know anything else about bigger cities?
They have more people.
They have more people? Do those people tend to be healthier or less healthy? This exclusion restriction is a big if. If a patient's location is random, then the distance between yourself and the nearest catheterizing hospital functions as if it's randomly assigned, but this is a big if. Maybe where you live is associated with both the kind of hospital you're closest to, and also health outcomes. Maybe this is not an exclusive instrument. We've talked about this in class before, where some hospitals tend to be better equipped for some things, and hospitals that are better equipped tend to serve a wealthier, healthier patient base. Remember, it's our job here not to get into the math behind the data, but to think through these data in a critical way. So what did this medical study find? They found that without using an instrumental variable, there was a significant and large effect of cardiac catheterization, which is a really difficult word to say when you're wearing a mask and it's 8:30 in the morning. So before we account for the fact that this variable is endogenous, we think that this is a good procedure. We think it improves the longevity of heart attack patients. We think there are good patient outcomes when you get this procedure done. But when we account for the endogeneity, when we look at the instrumental variable results, we see a small, often insignificant effect, which suggests that those good patient outcomes were due to the fact that the decision to have a catheter, or to give a catheter if you're the doctor, is endogenous. It's determined within the system. There's unobserved patient health variables. Your doctor might give you a catheter if you're more likely to survive anyway. Healthier patients are the ones that receive these cardiac catheters. It's important to account for endogeneity. Questions so far? So let's talk about meth. Who wants to tell me something about meth? Who's seen Breaking Bad before? All right, Bree, tell me something about meth.
It is very bad for me. Sorry, my brain is not listening today. It's like, how can I put it? It's like a white substance, sort of.
Okay, yeah, meth is a drug. Meth is toxic, poisonous to the mind, poisonous to the body, highly addictive. When you take it, you have increased energy, you feel more alert. You have decreased appetite, intense feelings of euphoria, impaired judgment, possible psychosis. And the meth epidemic in particular relative to, say, the early 90s, early to mid 90s, was hitting the western and southwestern United States probably worse. Meth's really bad. But we want to know, how bad is it? And particularly, we want to know how bad is it for kids. And this is not some sort of intellectual exercise. This is not some sort of curve-fitting exercise. This is a really important and profound question. Because if we can come up with good causal estimates for just how bad meth is, and just how bad meth is for children in at-risk populations, then we can direct policy to help prevent this severe crisis. So if we want to know just how bad meth is, and if we want to know just how bad meth is for children, how might we do this? How might we use data to solve this question? Yeah, Juliet.
I have a really interesting idea, but it's very specific.
Okay, let's hear it.
What if you looked at how kids that didn't get diagnosed with ADHD react to some of the medications used? Because that is close enough to the compound.
Okay, excellent point. So we know that some ADHD medication is amphetamine, which is closely related to methamphetamine. We might want to know how bad meth is for kids by looking at ADHD diagnoses. Excellent point, excellent use of sort of a natural experiment. Anyone else? Anyone have any ideas of how we might look at how bad the meth epidemic, and particularly the meth epidemic in the American West and Southwest in the early to mid 90s was for children? Yeah, Lily. Okay, so we can look at medical records, we can look at data, we can look at kids who have been exposed versus kids who have not been exposed. Anyone else? Yeah, Ashley. Okay, so we can look at babies that were exposed in utero. Anyone else? Great job. To sum it all up, we can collect data. So the data that this paper is looking at is data on child abuse and foster care. When meth is prevalent, are abuse cases up? Are admissions into foster care up? Why might use of these data be problematic? When we're looking at how bad meth is for children, why might data concerning abuse and foster care be problematic? Yeah, Lily. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Huh? Yeah, exactly. Bad parenting is endogenous. Parents who take meth were probably already fairly likely to engage in acts of abuse. Drug use and neglect have this simultaneous causality bias. Drug use and neglect happen in equilibrium. And again, there's a lot of ways that meth can be bad for people and adults. There's a lot of ways that meth can be bad for children in general. But one of the ways we can look at how meth is bad for children in particular is looking at cases of abuse and cases of foster care admissions. The problem is those parents who abuse their children might have abused their children anyway without meth. Parents who are deciding to take meth probably, like Lily said, have a lot of other issues going on. So what can we do about this? And by about this, I mean in a data-driven sense. How can we come up with some good causal estimates knowing that we've got an endogenous variable? There's only going to be one answer to that question this lecture. Take an instrumental variable approach. So again, can anyone think of anything? Can anyone think of an instrument that is both strong, both correlates with the decision to use meth, but also exclusive, does not correlate with foster care admissions or abuse cases? Juliet, you were already thinking about some interesting natural experiments, how there might be variation in, say, the drugs available. Tell me what's on your mind. Mm-hmm. Right, excellent point. So maybe there's some regional differences that are going to help us instrument for this endogenous variable. Let's dive a little deeper. Why might there be regional differences? Annika. Income in the area, job opportunities. Why might there be, let's get closer to meth, why might there be regional differences in meth use? Yeah, Elizabeth. Where the meth is coming from. Great job. So let's look at what the authors used as their instrumental variable approach, which was the Domestic Chemical Diversion Control Acts. There were two in the 90s. There was the one in 1995 and then the follow-up one in 1996. These acts, though verbose, we don't have to get into all the text of them. All we need to know is what these chemical diversion acts did. You might have experienced this in your own lives. They make it harder to buy ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. These chemical diversion acts made it harder to buy cold medicine. Why is that? Who knows? Yeah, because you make meth with cold medicine. We've all seen Breaking Bad. So why might making it harder to buy Sudafed be a good instrument for meth use? What happens to meth when it's harder to buy Sudafed? There's less of it? All right, now, not all of you at econ, but those of you who have, when there's less meth, what happens to it? Supply goes down, then what? Prices go up. When it's harder to buy Sudafed, it's harder to make meth, the price of meth goes up. This might be a strong instrument because when these acts passed in 1995 and 1996, and it was harder to buy cold medicine, the price of meth went up. Let's go on to something a little bit more difficult. Why might this be an exclusive instrument? Why might the price of meth not be correlated with our outcome variables, which are foster care admissions and cases of abuse and neglect? All right. So when you make it harder to buy Sudafed, it's harder to make meth. This makes the price go up. The Domestic Chemical Diversion Control Acts of 1995 and 1996, which made it harder to buy cold medicine, also made it harder to make meth, drove the price of meth up. But we think this might be an exclusive instrument because price doesn't cause child abuse in and of itself, we hope. It's just a piece of information about the world around us, about the relative scarcity of meth. This could be a bad instrument. This instrument could lack validity for a bunch of reasons. If meth production isn't domestic, if drug dealers are shipping meth in from neighboring countries, then making it harder to buy Sudafed at your local Walmart really won't make a difference. Maybe it's not a strong instrument. Maybe prices can cause increased cases of child abuse if there's some sort of, frustration with the price of meth that leads you to take it out on your kids. Maybe this is not a good instrument. But we have reason to believe that this might be a good instrument. Seems like making it harder to buy Sudafed drove the price of meth up. We have data on that. And we have theory behind why prices might not be related to cases of foster care admission, child abuse, and neglect. They found just that in the paper, by the way. They found a strong first stage. They found that that the passage of these acts did drive the price of meth up. Importantly, people in the 90s in the American West and Southwest who were taking meth, when the price of meth drove up, did not shift their consumption to related drugs like cocaine or heroin. Consumption of cocaine and heroin stayed relatively flat. To our point earlier about collecting data, we have these data from DEA Freedom of Information Act requests. So we have this strong first stage. Passing these acts makes it harder to buy meth. Price goes up. In the second stage, I didn't put these slides up there. In the second stage, we see that there are fewer admissions into foster care, fewer cases of abuse as a result. And importantly, when you're admitted into foster care, or when there's an investigation into parent acts of abuse, the reasons why are listed on the report. And listing meth as a reason on that report dropped in this strong second stage. So we think we have a pretty valid instrument. But it's important to remember that instrumental variables are both an art and a science. We talked about this a little bit on Monday. We're not going into the math behind it. We're not deriving any estimator functions. We're just thinking critically about why these instruments might be strong and why they might be exclusive. This is a leadership class. It's our job as leaders to think about cause and effect. And in doing so, it's our job to identify possible and plausible sources of endogeneity, whether it's omitted variable bias or reverse causality bias, or just something being determined from within the system more general. It's our job to think of plausible ways we can instrument for this endogeneity. And then conditional on thinking of these instruments, it's our job to discuss whether or not they're appropriate, whether we can get a true causal estimate from these variables. Let's note that this is actually really hard work. All the papers, all the IVs we're seeing today in class are from really groundbreaking and highly cited scientific articles. And yet here, after only, 9 weeks of decisions in a data-driven world, we're already able to critique them at quite a profound level. You all should be very proud with the thoughts you've had today about what makes up these instrumental variables and whether or not they're valid instruments. The rest of class is just taking a couple examples and critiquing them. And again, these examples are non-trivial. We want to know whether or not these estimates are causal for very good reasons. They tell us where to direct our efforts. They tell us where to direct policy. They can help people, whether they're heart attack patients or kids in need or people moving from place to place. So with that in mind, let's ask whether or not highways cause suburbanization. And the question at hand specifically is, did the interstate highway system, the Eisenhower interstate highway system, cause people to move out of central cities and into the suburbs? Where's the source of endogeneity here? How might this question be problematic? Why might this question be determined from within its own system? What do you guys think? Yeah, Annika. Okay, so maybe there's a different reason why, and specifically maybe people moving out of the cities caused us to build a highway system. There could be some reverse causality. Maybe it's people moving out of the cities that causes us to build highways. Anyone have any sense of how we could instrument for this? The one they use is actually kind of esoteric, let's say. Anyone have any ideas? Something that correlates with highways being built, but doesn't correlate with people moving? So what Nate Baum-Snow used, who is at Brown, was not the plan to build not the highways themselves, but the 1947 construction plan for building the highways. The reason for it is because building the highways was allegedly, who remembers their late 40s, early 50s history? Who remembers why Eisenhower wanted to build an interstate system?
So that they could land planes on there?
Yeah. National defense. The instrumental variable approach was not the actual highways that got built, but the original 1947 planned highway construction. This is a little esoteric, so remember, you should be very proud for thinking about this all the way through. Why might this be a strong instrument? Why might this be a strong instrument? Well, certainly a highway plan should reflect the highways that ultimately get built, right? Why might it be an exclusive instrument? Because we build highways, or plan to build them at least, to facilitate national defense. Eisenhower saw the Autobahn when he was in Germany during World War II and said, we need one of those. We need to be able to land planes. We need to be able to move tanks from place to place. We need a big interstate highway system. The strength of the instrument is because the plan reflects the ultimate construction, and that's what we want to know. Did the construction cause people to move into the suburbs? the paper argues that the plan was originally for national defense and not local commuting efforts. So it sounds like it's exclusive. The plan shouldn't influence whether or not you're moving into the suburbs. Questions so far? Why might this instrument be problematic? Why might it either fail to be a strong instrument or fail to be an exclusive instrument? So the argument that highways are for national defense is actually not quite accurate. National defense language was added to help these plans pass Congress, but everyone knew that if we had an interstate highway system, you would use it for local commuting efforts. And this kind of makes sense, right? Knowing what we know about Congress today, people lobby Congress. So, Beth, you know that Congress is talking about whether or not to plan a national defense system which is going to have big roads that's going to bring business to your town. Are you going to advocate that Route 29 gets added to the highway system? You as Congressperson Beth? Yeah, you're going to lobby for your district. You're going to say, I want people driving from Charlottesville down to Lynchburg. I want people moving here. I want business moving here. The plan is not as exclusive as it claims to be. An exclusive instrument only influences the outcome variable, in this case suburbanization, through the endogenous variable, in this case highways. But the plan influences suburbanization in lots of other ways. By lobbying Congress, by putting up support for the places that have planned construction. This instrument, though highly cited in the scientific literature, might not be as exclusive as it claims to be. All right, we've only got a few minutes left of class. Let's go on to another one. All right, let's talk about government-initiated resource. When these community groups are formed, is endogenous to member characteristics. So though the 1993 law established these community groups, they didn't all come into being at the same time. And when these groups are formed, is going to also contain information like how much is that group using fuel, how amenable is that group to conservation efforts, do birds get in that group's auditorium, things like that. So, can anyone think of an instrumental variable here? It's fine if you can't. We're not all expert on, in fact, none of us are expert on Nepalese forests. But remember, instrumental variables are sort of weird, sort of funny. Yeah, Elizabeth.
I'm not sure if this would be one, but like the type of community, if it's like close to the forest versus in like a more urbanized area.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's actually what the paper uses. We'll put it in a different term. We'll put distance to the nearest forestry extension office, which is also called a range post. So in community-initiated resource management, we have distance to the nearest forestry extension office or range post. And this is kind of similar to our cardiac catheter paper, right? Distance to something. This is actually pretty common as an instrumental approach. Because sometimes we can plausibly argue that distance is as if random. Not random per se, but functions as if it were randomly assigned. So Elizabeth, I'm going to pick on you a little bit since you threw up the idea. Why did you say that? Why do you think this might be a good instrument? Okay, well, while you think of that, anyone else, why might this be a good instrument? Peyton, is that a hand, or you're just protecting yourself from the bird? I'm so sorry, I did not hear you at all. Right. So maybe distance is a good proxy for people, and people are the ones using the firewood. Great job. Anyone else? Why might this be a strong instrument? Okay, why might this be an exclusive instrument? Why might distance not correlate to anything else, any of these endogenous factors? Why might distance only correlate to whether or not you form a community group? All right, let's fast forward since it looks like everyone's focused on the bird anyway. So the argument is that when we're looking at deforestation, if there's a range post there, it's accessible to loggers. If there's a range post, it's more accessible to loggers. This is going to have an influence on whether or not there's a community group and how much that community group manages. Why might it be exclusive? Because where you live was established long before these forestry extension offices, long before the law came into place, long before the range posts came into place. Jackie, I'm going to pick on you for this one. Why might this be a bad instrument? Why might distance to the nearest range office be a bad instrument? Right. Different people live in different places, and those different people might have different approaches to firewood. They might have different approaches to other things. Elizabeth.
This is very similar to that, but just that there might be different needs for firewood or alternative fuel sources in different areas.
Yeah, you're both absolutely right. Households that live further from range posts might use fuel differently. Further, they might live farther from range posts because they have different views on government-initiated resource management. Maybe the households that live pretty far from the forestry office don't want anyone telling them how to use their fuel. To sum it all up, just these big lessons we've already been talking about, these instrumental variables are both an art and a science. It's our job to recognize these sources of endogeneity, thinking about what might be a good instrument, but also think about why these instruments might fail us. Questions or comments? All right, so that's it for today. Pack it up and go home. We regroup on Friday, hopefully with no avian neighbors. We'll be talking about chapter 17 in Oster. I know it's a part of the semester where a bunch of people have paperwork for me to sign, so if you've got any, just bring it up.